The Leavenworth Case, A Lawyer's Story, by Katharine Green, Part 2, Expert Testimony. And oftentimes, to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles, to betray us in deepest consequence. Macbeth. In the midst of the universal gloom thus awakened, there came a sharp ring at the bell. Instantly all eyes turned toward the parlour door, just as it slowly opened. And the officer who had been sent off so mysteriously by the coroner an hour before entered, in company with a young man whose sleek appearance, intelligent eye, and general air of trustworthiness seemed to proclaim him to be, what in fact he was, the confidential clerk of a responsible mercantile house. Advancing without apparent embarrassment, though each and every eye in the room was fixed upon him with lively curiosity, he made a slight bow to the coroner. "You have sent for a man from Bone & Co.," he said. Strong and immediate excitement. Bone & Co. was the well-known pistol and ammunition store of Broadway. "Yes, sir," returned the coroner. "We have here a bullet, which we must ask you to examine. You are fully acquainted with all matters connected with your business." The young man, merely elevating an expressive eyebrow, took the bullet carelessly in his hand. "Can you tell us from what make of pistol that was delivered?" The young man rolled it slowly round between his thumb and forefinger, and then laid it down. "It is a No. 32 ball, usually sold with the small pistol made by Smith & Wesson." "Ah, small pistol," exclaimed the butler, jumping up from his seat. "Master used to keep a little pistol in his stand drawer. I have often seen it. We all knew about it, but great and irrepressible excitement, especially among the servants." "That's so," I heard a heavy voice exclaim. "I saw it once myself. Master was cleaning it." It was the cook who spoke. "In his stand drawer?" The coroner inquired. "West, sir, at the head of his bed." An officer was sent to examine the stand drawer. In a few moments he returned, bringing a small pistol, which he laid down on the coroner's table, saying, "Here it is." Immediately, every one sprang to his feet, but the coroner, handing it over to the clerk from Bond's, inquired if that was the make before mentioned. Without hesitation he replied, "Yes, Smith & Wesson. You can see for yourself," and he proceeded to examine it. "Where did you find this pistol?" asked the coroner of the officer. "In the top drawer of a shaving table standing near the head of Mr. Leavenworth's bed. It was lying in a velvet case together with a box of cartridges, one of which I bring as a sample," and he laid it down beside the bullet. "Was the drawer locked?" "West, sir," but the key was not taken out. Interest had now reached its climax. A universal cry swept through the room, "Is it loaded?" The coroner, frowning on the assembly, with a look of great dignity, remarked, "I was about to ask that question myself, but first I must request order." An immediate calm followed. Every one was too much interested to interpose any obstacle in the way of gratifying his curiosity. "Now, sir," exclaimed the coroner. The clerk from Bond's, taking out the cylinder, held it up. "There are 7 chambers here, and they are all loaded." A murmur of disappointment followed this assertion. "But," he quietly added after a momentary examination of the face of the cylinder, "they have not all been loaded long. A bullet has been recently shot from one of these chambers." "How do you know?" cried one of the jury. "How do I know? Sir," said he, turning to the coroner, "will you be kind enough to examine the condition of this pistol?" And he handed it over to that gentleman. "Look first at the barrel. It is clean and bright, and shows no evidence of a bullet having passed out of it very lately. That is because it has been cleaned. But now, observe the face of the cylinder. What do you see there?" "I see a faint line of smut near one of the chambers." "Just so. Show it to the gentleman." It was immediately handed down. "That faint line of smut on the edge of one of the chambers is the telltale, sirs. A bullet passing out always leaves smut behind. The man who fired this, remembering the fact, cleaned the barrel, but forgot the cylinder, and stepping aside he folded his arms. Jerusalem. Spoke out a rough, hearty voice, "Isn't that wonderful?" This exclamation came from a countryman who had stepped in from the street, and now stood agape in the doorway. It was a rude but not altogether unwelcome interruption. A smile passed round the room, and both men and women breathed more easily. Order being at last restored, the officer was requested to describe the position of the stand and its distance from the library table. The library table is in one room, and the stand in another. To reach the former from the latter, one would be obliged to cross Mr. Leavenworth's bedroom in a diagonal direction, pass through the passageway separating that one apartment from the other end. Wait a moment. How does this table stand in regard to the door which leads from the bedroom into the hall? One might enter that door, pass directly round the foot of the bed to the stand, procure the pistol, and cross halfway over to the passageway, without being seen by any one sitting or standing in the library beyond. Holy Virgin! Exclaimed the horrified cook, throwing her apron over her head as if to shut out some dreadful vision. Hannah niver would have the pluck for that, niver, niver. But Mr. Gryce, laying a heavy hand on the woman, forced her back into her seat, reproving and calming her at the same time, with a dexterity marvellous to behold. "I beg your pardons," she cried deprecatingly to those around, "but it niver was Hannah, niver." The clerk from Bones here being dismissed, those assembled took the opportunity of making some change in their position, after which the name of Mr. Harwell was again called. That person rose with manifest reluctance. Evidently the preceding testimony had either upset some theory of his, or indubitably strengthened some unwelcome suspicion. "Mr. Harwell," the coroner began, "we are told of the existence of a pistol belonging to Miss Eyre. Leavenworth, and upon searching, we discover it in his room. Did you know of his possessing such an instrument?" "I did." "How was it a fact generally known in the house?" "So it would seem." "How was that?" "Was he in the habit of leaving it around where any one could see it?" "I cannot say. I can only acquaint you with the manner in which I myself became aware of its existence." "Very well. Do so." "We were once talking about firearms. I have some taste that way, and have always been anxious to possess a pocket pistol. Saying something of the kind to him one day, he rose from his seat, and fetching me this, showed it to me." "How long ago was this?" "Some few months since." "He has owned this pistol, then, for some time?" "Yes, sir." "Is that the only occasion upon which you have ever seen it?" "No, sir." The secretary blushed. "I have seen it once since. One, about 3 weeks ago." Under what circumstances? The secretary dropped his head, a certain drawn look making itself suddenly visible on his countenance. "Will you not excuse me, gentlemen?" he asked, after a moment's hesitation. "It is impossible," returned the coroner. His face grew even more pallid and deprecatory. "I am obliged to introduce the name of a lady," he hesitatingly declared. "We are very sorry," remarked the coroner. The young man turned fiercely upon him, and I could not help wondering that I had ever thought him commonplace. "Of Miss Eleanor Leavenworth," he cried. At that name, so uttered, every one started but Mr. Gryce. He was engaged in holding a close and confidential confab with his finger-tips, and did not appear to notice. "Surely it is contrary to the rules of decorum, and the respect we all feel for the lady herself, to introduce her name into this discussion," continued Mr. Harwell. But the coroner still insisting upon an answer, he refolded his arms, a movement indicative of resolution with him, and began in a low, forced tone to say, "What was my astonishment to come upon Miss Eleanor Leavenworth, standing at the side of her uncle's bed, with his pistol in her hand. It is only this, gentlemen. One afternoon, about 3 weeks since, I had occasion to go to the library at an unusual hour. Crossing over to the mantel-piece for the purpose of procuring a penknife which I had carelessly left there in the morning, I heard a noise in the adjoining room. Knowing that Mr. Leavenworth was out, and supposing the ladies to be out also, I took the liberty of ascertaining who the intruder was, when what was my astonishment to come upon Miss Eleanor Leavenworth, standing at the side of her uncle's bed, with his pistol in her hand. Confused at my indiscretion, I attempted to escape without being observed, but in vain, for just as I was crossing the threshold, she turned and, calling me by name, requested me to explain the pistol to her. Gentlemen, in order to do so, I was obliged to take it in my hand, and that, sirs, is the only other occasion upon which I ever saw or handled the pistol of Miss Leavenworth. Drooping his head, he waited in indescribable agitation for the next question. She asked you to explain the pistol to her. What do you mean by that? I mean, he faintly continued, catching his breath in a vain effort to appear calm, how to load, aim, and fire it. A flash of awakened feeling shot across the faces of all present. Even the coroner showed sudden signs of emotion, and sat staring at the bowed form and pale countenance of the man before him, with a peculiar look of surprised compassion, which could not fail of producing its effect, not only upon the young man himself, but upon all who saw him. Mr. Harwell, he at length inquired, have you anything to add to the statement you have just made? The secretary sadly shook his head. Monsieur Gryce, I hear whispered, clutching that person by the arm and dragging him down to my side. Assure me, I entreat you. But he would not let me finish. The coroner is about to ask for the young ladies, he quickly interposed. If you desire to fulfill your duty towards them, be ready, that's all. Fulfill my duty? The simple words recalled me to myself. What had I been thinking of? Was I mad? With nothing more terrible in mind than a tender picture of the lovely cousins bowed in anguish over the remains of one who had been as dear as a father to them, I slowly rose, and upon demand being made for Miss Mary and Miss Eleanor Leavenworth, advanced and said that, as a friend of the family. A petty lie, which I hope will not be laid up against me. I begged the privilege of going for the ladies and escorting them down. Instantly a dozen eyes flashed upon me, and I experienced the embarrassment of one who, by some unexpected word or action, has drawn upon himself the concentrated attention of a whole room. But the permission sought being almost immediately accorded, I was speedily enabled to withdraw from my rather trying position, finding myself, almost before I knew it, in the hall, my face aflame, my heart beating with excitement, and these words of Mr. Gryce ringing in my ears. 3rd floor, rear room, first door at the head of the stairs. You will find the young ladies expecting you. 6 side lights. Oh, she has beauty might ensnare a conqueror's soul, and make him leave his crown at random to be scuffled for by slaves. Otway. 3rd floor, rear room, first door at the head of the stairs. What was I about to encounter there? Mounting the lower flight, and shuddering by the library wall, which to my troubled fancy seemed written all over with horrible suggestions, I took my way slowly upstairs, revolving in my mind many things, among which an admonition uttered long ago by my mother occupied a prominent place. My son, remember that a woman with a secret may be a fascinating study, but she can never be a safe, nor even satisfactory. Companion a wise saw, no doubt, but totally inapplicable to the present situation. Yet it continued to haunt me till the sight of the door, to which I had been directed, put every other thought to flight save that I was about to meet the stricken nieces of a brutally murdered man. Pausing only long enough on the threshold to compose myself for the interview, I lifted my hand to knock. Pausing only long enough on the threshold to compose myself for the interview, I lifted my hand to knock, when a rich, clear voice rose from within, and I heard distinctly uttered these astounding words. I do not accuse your hand, though I know of none other which would or could have done this deed, but your heart, your head, your will, these I do and must accuse, in my secret mind at least, and it is well that you should know it. Struck with horror, I staggered back, my hands to my ears, when a touch fell on my arm, and turning, I saw Miss Gryce standing close beside me, with his finger on his lip, and the last flickering shadow of a flying emotion fading from his steady, almost compassionate countenance. "Come, come," he exclaimed. "I see you don't begin to know what kind of a world you are living in. Rouse yourself. Remember they are waiting down below." But who is it? Who was it that spoke? That we shall soon see. And without waiting to meet, much less answer, my appealing look, he struck his hand against the door and flung it wide open. Instantly a flush of lovely colour burst upon us. Blue curtains, blue carpets, blue walls. It was like a glimpse of heavenly azure in a spot where only darkness and gloom were to be expected. Fascinated by the sight, I stepped impetuously forward, but instantly paused again, overcome and impressed by the exquisite picture I saw before me. Her whole appearance was so startling, so extraordinary, that I held my breath in surprise. Seated in an easy chair of embroidered satin, but rosing from her half-recumbent position, like one who was in the act of launching a powerful invective, I beheld a glorious woman. Fair, frail, proud, delicate, looking like a lily in the thick, creamy-tinted wrapper that alternately clung to and swayed from her finely moulded figure, with her forehead, crowned with the palest of pale tresses, lifted and flashing with power, one quivering hand clasping the arm of her chair, the other outstretched and pointing towards some distant object in the room. Her whole appearance was so startling, so extraordinary, that I held my breath in surprise, actually for the moment doubting if it were a living woman I beheld, or some famous pythoness conjured up from ancient story, to express in one tremendous gesture the supreme indignation of outraged womanhood. "Miss Mary Leavenworth," whispered that ever-present voice over my shoulder. Ah, Mary Leavenworth. What a relief came with this name. This beautiful creature, then, was not the Eleanor who could load, aim, and fire a pistol. Turning my head, I followed the guiding of that uplifted hand, now frozen into its place by a new emotion, the emotion of being interrupted in the midst of a direful and pregnant revelation, and saw. But, no, here description fails me. Eleanor Leavenworth must be painted by other hands than mine. I could sit half the day and dilate upon the subtle grace, the pale magnificence, perfection of form and feature, which make Mary Leavenworth the wonder of all who behold her. But Eleanor could as soon paint the beatings of my own heart. Beguiling, terrible, grand, pathetic, that face of faces flashed upon my gaze, and instantly the moonlight loveliness of her cousin faded from my memory, and I saw only Eleanor from that moment on forever. When my glance first fell upon her, she was standing by the side of a small table, with her face turned toward her cousin, and her two hands resting, the one upon her breast, the other on the table, in an attitude of antagonism. But before the sudden pang which shot through me at the sight of her beauty had subsided, her head had turned, her gaze had encountered mine. All the horror of the situation had burst upon her, and, instead of a haughty woman, drawn up to receive and trample upon the insinuations of another I beheld, alas, a trembling, panting human creature, conscious that a sword hung above her head, and without a word to say why it should not fall and slay her. It was a pitiable change, a heart-rending revelation. I turned from it as from a confession. But just then, her cousin, who had apparently regained her self-possession at the first betrayal of emotion on the part of the other, stepped forward and, holding out her hand, inquired, "Is not this Mr. Raymond?" "How kind of you, sir." "And you?" Turning to Mr. Gryce, "You have come to tell us we are wanted below, is it not so?" It was the voice I had heard through the door, but modulated to a sweet, winning, almost caressing tone. Glancing hastily at Mr. Gryce, I looked to see how he was affected by it. Evidently much, for the bow with which he greeted her words was lower than ordinary, and the smile with which he met her earnest look both deprecatory and reassuring. His glance did not embrace her cousin, though her eyes were fixed upon his face with an inquiry in their depths more agonizing than the utterance of any cry would have been. Knowing Mr. Gryce as I did, I felt that nothing could promise worse or be more significant than this transparent disregard of one who seemed to fill the room with her terror. And, struck with pity, I forgot that Mary Leavenworth had spoken, forgot her very presence, in fact, and turning hastily away, took one step toward her cousin, when Mr. Gryce's hand, falling on my arm, stopped me. "Miss Leavenworth speaks," said he. Recalled to myself, I turned my back upon what had so interested me, even while it repelled, and forcing myself to make some sort of reply to the fair creature before me, offered my arm and led her toward the door. Immediately the pale, proud countenance of Mary Leavenworth softened almost to the point of smiling. And here let me say, there never was a woman who could smile and not smile like Mary Leavenworth. Looking in my face, with a frank and sweet appeal in her eyes, she murmured, "You are very good. I do feel the need of support. The occasion is so horrible, and my cousin there," here a little gleam of alarm nickered into her eyes, "is so very strange today." Humph! Thought I to myself, where is the grand indignant Pythoness, with the unspeakable wrath and menace in her countenance, whom I saw when I first entered the room? Could it be that she was trying to beguile us from our conjectures, by making light of her former expressions? Or was it possible she deceived herself so far as to believe us unimpressed by the weighty accusation overheard by us at a moment so critical? But Eleanor Leavenworth, leaning on the arm of the detective, soon absorbed all my attention. She had regained by this time her self-possession also, but not so entirely as her cousin. Her step faltered as she endeavored to walk, and the hand which rested on his arm trembled like a leaf. Would to God I had never entered this house, said I to myself, and yet, before the exclamation was half uttered, I became conscious of a secret rebellion against the thought, an emotion, shall I say, of thankfulness that it had been myself, rather than another who had been allowed to break in upon their privacy, overhear that significant remark, and, shall I acknowledge it, follow Mr. Gryce and the trembling, swaying figure of Eleanor Leavenworth downstairs. Not that I felt the least relenting in my soul towards guilt. Crime had never looked so black, revenge, selfishness, hatred. Cupidity never seemed more loathsome, and yet— But why enter into the consideration of my feelings at that time? They cannot be of interest. Besides, who can fathom the depths of his own soul, or untangle for others the secret cords of revulsion and attraction which are, and ever have been, a mystery and wonder to himself? Enough that, supporting upon my arm the half-fainting form of one woman, but with my attention and interest devoted to another, I descended the stairs of the Leavenworth mansion, and re-entered the dreaded presence of those inquisitors of the law who had been so impatiently awaiting us. As I once more crossed that threshold, and faced the eager countenances of those I had left so short a time before, I felt as if ages had elapsed in the interval. So much can be experienced by the human soul in the short space of a few overweighted moments. 7. Mary Leavenworth. For this relief much thanks. Hamlet. Have you ever observed the effect of the sunlight bursting suddenly upon the earth from behind a mass of heavily surcharged clouds? If so, you can have some idea of the sensation produced in that room by the entrance of these two beautiful ladies, possessed of a loveliness which would have been conspicuous in all places and under all circumstances, Mary at least, if not her less striking, though by no means less interesting cousin, could never have entered any assemblage without drawing to herself the wondering attention of all present. But heralded as here, by the most fearful of tragedies, what could you expect from a collection of men, such as I have already described, but overmastering wonder and incredulous admiration? Nothing, perhaps, and yet at the first murmuring sound of amazement and satisfaction, I felt my soul recoil in disgust. Making haste to seat my now trembling companion in the most retired spot I could find, I looked around for her cousin. But Eleanor Leavenworth, weak as she had appeared in the interview above, showed at this moment neither hesitation nor embarrassment. Advancing upon the arm of the detective, whose suddenly assumed air of persuasion in the presence of the jury was anything but reassuring. She stood for an instant gazing calmly upon the scene before her. Then, bowing to the coroner with a grace and condescension which seemed at once to place him on the footing of a politely endured intruder in this home of elegance, she took the seat which her own servants hastened to procure for her, with an ease and dignity that rather recalled the triumphs of the drawing-room than the self-consciousness of a scene such as that in which we found ourselves. Palpable acting though this was, it was not without its effect. Instantly the murmurs ceased, the obtrusive glances fell, and something like a forced respect made itself visible upon the countenances of all present. Even I, impressed as I had been by her very different demeanour in the room above, experienced a sensation of relief, and was more than startled when, upon turning to the lady at my side, I beheld her eyes riveted upon her cousin with an inquiry in their depths that was anything but encouraging. Fearful of the effect this look might have upon those about us, I hastily seized her hand which, clenched and unconscious, hung over the edge of her chair, and was about to beseech her to have care, when her name, called in a slow, impressive way by the coroner, roused her from her abstraction. Hurriedly withdrawing her gaze from her cousin, she lifted her face to the jury, and I saw a gleam pass over it which brought back my early fancy of the Pythoness. But it passed, and it was with an expression of great modesty she settled herself to respond to the demand of the coroner and answer the first few opening inquiries. But what can express the anxiety of that moment to me? Gentle as she now appeared, she was capable of great wrath, as I knew. Was she going to reiterate her suspicions here? Did she hate as well as mistrust her cousin? Would she dare assert in this presence, and before the world, what she found it so easy to utter in the privacy of her own room and the hearing of the one person concerned? Did she wish to? Her own countenance gave me no clue to her intentions, and in my anxiety I turned once more to look at Eleanor, but she, in a dread and apprehension I could easily understand, had recoiled at the first intimation that her cousin was to speak, and now sat with her face covered from sight, by hands blanched to an almost deathly whiteness. The testimony of Mary Leavenworth was short. After some few questions, mostly referring to her position in the house and her connection with its deceased master, she was asked to relate what she knew of the murder itself, and of its discovery by her cousin and the servants. Lifting up a brow that seemed never till known now the shadow of care or trouble, and a voice that, whilst low and womanly, rang like a bell through the room, she replied, "You ask me, gentlemen, a question which I cannot answer of my own personal knowledge. I know nothing of this murder, nor of its discovery, save what has come to me through the lips of others." My heart gave a bound of relief, and I saw Eleanor Leavenworth's hands drop from her brow like stone, while a flickering gleam as of hope fled over her face, and then died away like sunlight leaving marble. For, strange as it may seem to you, Mary earnestly continued, the shadow of a past horror revisiting her countenance, I did not enter the room where my uncle lay. I did not even think of doing so. My only impulse was to fly from what was so horrible and heart-rending. But Eleanor went in, and she can tell you. Or will question Miss Eleanor Leavenworth later. Interrupted the coroner, but very gently for him. Evidently the grace and elegance of this beautiful woman were making their impression. What we want to know is what you saw. You say you cannot tell us of anything that passed in the room at the time of the discovery. No, Sir Bow. Only what occurred in the hall. Nothing occurred in the hall, she innocently remarked. Did not the servants pass in from the hall, and your cousin come out there after her revival from her fainting fit? Mary Leavenworth's violet eyes opened wonderingly. Yes, sir. But that was nothing. You remember, however, her coming into the hall. Yes, sir. But with a paper in her hand. Paper. And she wheeled suddenly and looked at her cousin. Did you have a paper, Eleanor? The moment was intense. Eleanor Leavenworth, who at the first mention of the word paper had started perceptibly, rose to her feet at this naive appeal, and opening her lips, seemed about to speak, when the coroner, with a strict sense of what was regular, lifted his hand with decision, and said, "You need not ask your cousin, miss, but let us hear what you have to say yourself." Immediately, Eleanor Leavenworth sank back, a pink spot breaking out on either cheek, while a slight murmur testified to the disappointment of those in the room who were more anxious to have their curiosity gratified than the forms of law adhered to. Satisfied with having done his duty, and disposed to be easy with so charming a witness, the coroner repeated his question. "Tell us, if you please, if you saw any such thing in her hand."
"Oh, no.
"I saw nothing." Being now questioned in relation to the events of the previous night, she had no new light to throw upon the subject. She acknowledged her uncle to have been a little reserved at dinner, but no more so than at previous times, when annoyed by some business anxiety. Asked if she had seen her uncle again that evening, she said no, that she had been detained in her room, that the sight of him, sitting in his seat at the head of the table, was the very last remembrance she had of him. There was something so touching, so forlorn, and yet so unobtrusive in this simple recollection of hers, that a look of sympathy passed slowly around the room. I even detected Mr. Gryce softening towards the inkstand, but Eleanor Leavenworth sat unmoved. "Was your uncle on ill terms with any one?" was now asked. Had he valuable papers, or saw secret sums of money in his possession? To all these inquiries she returned an equal negative. "Has your uncle met any stranger lately, or received any important letter during the last few weeks?" which might seem in any way to throw light upon this mystery. There was the slightest perceptible hesitation in her voice, as she replied, "No, not to my knowledge. I don't know of any such." But here, stealing a side glance at Eleanor, she evidently saw something that reassured her, for she hastened to add, "I believe I may go further than that, and meet your question with a positive no. My uncle was in the habit of confiding in me, and I should have known if anything of importance to him had occurred." Questioned in regard to Hannah, she gave that person the best of characters, knew of nothing which could have led her to her strange disappearance, or to her connection with crime. Could not say whether she kept any company, or had any visitors, only knew that no one with any such pretensions came to the house. Finally, when asked when she had last seen the pistol which Mr. Leavenworth always kept in his stand-drawer, she returned, not since the day he bought it, Eleanor, and not herself, having the charge of her uncle's apartments. It was the only thing she had said which, even to a mind freighted like mine, would seem to point to any private doubt or secret suspicion, and this, uttered in the careless manner in which it was, would have passed without comment if Eleanor herself had not directed at that moment a very much aroused and inquiring look upon the speaker. But it was time for the inquisitive juror to make himself heard again. Edging to the brink of the chair, he drew in his breath, with a vague awe of Mary's beauty, almost ludicrous to see, and asked if she had properly considered what she had just said. "I hope, sir, I consider all I am called upon to say at such a time as this," was her earnest reply. The little juror drew back, and I looked to see her examination terminate, when suddenly his ponderous colleague of the watch-chain, catching the young lady's eye, inquired, "Miss Leavenworth, did your uncle ever make a will?" Instantly every man in the room was in arms, and even she could not prevent the slow blush of injured pride from springing to her cheek. But her answer was given firmly, and without any show of resentment. "Yes, sir," she returned simply. "More than one. I never heard of but one. Doc, are you acquainted with the contents of that will?" "I am." He made no secret of his intentions to any one. The German lifted his eye-glass and looked at her. Her grace was little to him, or her beauty, or her elegance. Perhaps, then, You can tell me who is the one most likely to be benefited by his death." The brutality of this question was too marked to pass unchallenged. Not a man in that room, myself included, but frowned with sudden disapprobation. But Mary Leavenworth, drawing herself up, looked her interlocutor calmly in the face, and restrained herself to say, "I know who would be the greatest losers by it. The children he took to his bosom in their helplessness and sorrow, the young girls he enshrined with the halo of his love and protection, when love and protection were what their immaturity most demanded, the women who looked to him for guidance when childhood and youth were past. These, sir, these are the ones to whom his death is a loss, in comparison to which all others which may hereafter befall them must ever seem trivial and unimportant." It was a noble reply to the basest of insinuations, and the juryman drew back rebuked. But here another of them, one who had not spoken before, but whose appearance was not only superior to the rest, but also almost imposing in its gravity, leaned from his seat, and in a solemn voice said, "Miss Leavenworth, the human mind cannot help forming impressions. Now have you, with or without reason, felt at any time conscious of a suspicion pointing towards any one person as the murderer of your uncle?" It was a frightful moment. To me and to one other, I am sure it was not only frightful, but agonizing. Would her courage fail? Would her determination to shield her cousin remain firm in the face of duty and at the call of probity? I dared not hope it. But Mary Leavenworth, rising to her feet, looked judge and jury calmly in the face, and, without raising her voice, giving it an indescribably clear and sharp intonation, replied, "No, I have neither suspicion nor reason for any. The assassin of my uncle is not only entirely unknown to, but completely unsuspected by me." It was like the removal of a stifling pressure. Amid a universal outgoing of the breath, Mary Leavenworth stood aside, and Eleanor was called in her place. 8 circumstantial evidence. Oh, dark, dark, dark. And now that the interest was at its height, that the veil which shrouded this horrible tragedy seemed about to be lifted, if not entirely withdrawn, I felt a desire to fly the scene, to leave the spot, to know no more. Not that I was conscious of any particular fear of this woman betraying herself. The cold steadiness of her now fixed and impassive countenance was sufficient warranty in itself against the possibility of any such catastrophe. But if, indeed, the suspicions of her cousin were the offspring, not only of hatred but of knowledge, if that face of beauty was in truth only a mask, and Eleanor Leavenworth was what the words of her cousin and her own after behaviour would seem to imply, how could I bear to sit there and see the frightful serpent of deceit and sin evolve itself from the bosom of this white rose? And yet, such is the fascination of uncertainty that, although I saw something of my own feelings reflected in the countenances of many about me, not a man in all that assemblage showed any disposition to depart, I least of all. The coroner, upon whom the blonde loveliness of Mary had impressed itself to Eleanor's apparent detriment, was the only one in the room who showed himself unaffected at this moment. Turning toward the witness with a look which, while respectful, had a touch of austerity in it, he began, "You have been an intimate of Mr. Leavenworth's family from childhood, they tell me, Miss Leavenworth." "From my 10th year," was her quiet reply. "It was the first time I had heard her voice. It surprised me. It was so like, and yet so unlike, that of her cousin. Similar in tone, it lacked its expressiveness, if I may so speak, sounding without vibration on the ear, and ceasing without an echo. Since that time you have been treated like a daughter, they tell me." "Wes, sir, like a daughter. Indeed, he was more than a father to both of us. You and Miss Mary Leavenworth are cousins, I believe. When did she enter the family?" "At the same time I did. Our respective parents were victims of the same disaster. If it had not been for our uncle, we should have been thrown, children as we were, upon the world." "But hey—" Here she paused, her firm lips breaking into a half-tremble. "But he, in the goodness of his heart, adopted us into his family, and gave us what we had both lost, a father and a home. You say he was a father to you as well as to your cousin, that he adopted you. Do you mean by that he not only surrounded you with present luxury, but gave you to understand that the same should be secured to you after his death, in short, that he intended to leave any portion of his property to you? No, sir, I was given to understand, from the first, that his property would be bequeathed by will to my cousin. Your cousin was no more nearly related to him than yourself, Miss Leavenworth. Did he never give you any reason for this evident partiality? None but his pleasure, sir. Her answers up to this point had been so straightforward and satisfactory that a gradual confidence seemed to be taking the place of the rather uneasy doubts which had from the first circled about this woman's name and person. But at this admission, uttered as it was in a calm, unimpassioned voice, not only the jury, but myself, who had so much truer reason for distrusting her, felt that actual suspicion in her case must be very much shaken before the utter lack of motive which this reply so clearly betokened. Meanwhile the coroner continued, "If your uncle was as kind to you as you say, you must have become very much attached to him. Wes, sir," her mouth taking a sudden determined curve. "His death, then, must have been a great shock to you. Very, very great. Enough of itself to make you faint away, as they tell me you did, at the first glimpse you had of his body. Enough, quite. And yet you seem to be prepared for it. Prepared. The servants say you were much agitated at finding your uncle did not make his appearance at the breakfast table." The servants! Her tongue seemed to cleave to the roof of her mouth. She could hardly speak. That when you returned from his room you were very pale. Was she beginning to realize that there was some doubt, if not actual suspicion, in the mind of the man who could assail her with questions like these? I had not seen her so agitated since that one memorable instant up in her room. But her mistrust, if she felt any, did not long betray itself. Calming herself by a great effort, she replied with a quiet gesture, "That is not so strange. My uncle was a very methodical man. The least change in his habits would be likely to awaken our apprehensions, Dar. You were alarmed then." "To a certain extent I was." "Miss Leavenworth, who is in the habit of overseeing the regulation of your uncle's private apartments?" "I am, sir." "You are doubtless, then, acquainted with a certain stand in his room containing a drawer?" "Wes, sir. How long is it since you had occasion to go to this drawer?" "Yesterday," visibly trembling at the admission. "At what time?" "Near noon, I should judge." "Was the pistol he was accustomed to keep there in its place at the time?" "Oh, I presume so. I did not observe." "Did you turn the key upon closing the drawer?" "I did." "Take it out." "No, sir." "Knew Miss Leavenworth that pistol, as you have perhaps observed, lies on the table before you?" "Will you look at it?" And lifting it up into view, he held it towards her. If he had meant to startle her by the sudden action, he amply succeeded. At the first sight of the murderous weapon she shrank back, and a horrified, but quickly suppressed shriek burst from her lips. "Oh, no, no," she moaned, flinging out her hands before her. "I must insist upon your looking at it, Miss Leavenworth," pursued the coroner. "When it was found just now, all the chambers were loaded." Instantly the agonized look left her countenance. "Oh, then—" She did not finish, but put out her hand for the weapon. But the coroner, looking at her steadily, continued, "It has been lately fired off, for all that. The hand that cleaned the barrel forgot the cartridge chamber, Miss Leavenworth." She did not shriek again, but a hopeless, helpless look slowly settled over her face, and she seemed about to sink. But like a flash the reaction came, and lifting her head with a steady, grand action, "I have never seen equalled," she exclaimed. "Very well, what then?" The coroner laid the pistol down. Men and women glanced at each other. Every one seemed to hesitate to proceed. I heard a tremulous sigh at my side, and turning, beheld Mary Leavenworth staring at her cousin with a startled flush on her cheek, as if she began to recognize that the public, as well as herself, detected something in this woman, calling for explanation. At last the coroner summoned up courage to continue. "You ask me, Miss Leavenworth, upon the evidence given. What then? Your question obliges me to say that no burglar, no hired assassin, would have used this pistol for a murderous purpose, and then taken the pains, not only to clean it, but to reload it and lock it up again in the drawer from which he had taken it." She did not reply to this, but I saw Mr. Gryce make a note of it with that peculiar emphatic nod of his. Nor, he went on, even more gravely, would it be possible for anyone who was not accustomed to pass in and out of Mr. Leavenworth's room at all hours, to enter his door so late at night, procure this pistol from its place of concealment, traverse his apartment, and advance as closely upon him as the facts show to have been necessary, without causing him at least to turn his head to one side, which, in consideration of the doctor's testimony, we cannot believe he did. It was a frightful suggestion, and we looked to see Eleanor Leavenworth recoil. But that expression of outraged feeling was left for her cousin to exhibit. Starting indignantly from her seat, Mary cast one hurried glance around her, and opened her lips to speak, but Eleanor, slightly turning, motioned her to have patience, and replied in a cold and calculating voice, "You are not sure, sir, that this was done. If my uncle, for some purpose of his own, had fired the pistol off yesterday, let us say, which is surely possible, if not probable, the like results would be observed, and the same conclusions drawn. Miss Leavenworth," the coroner went on, "the ball has been extracted from your uncle's head." "Ah!" "It corresponds with those in the cartridges found in his stand drawer, and is of the number used with this pistol." Her head fell forward on her hands. Her eyes sought the floor. Her whole attitude expressed disheartenment. Seeing it, the coroner grew still more grave. "Miss Leavenworth," said he, "I have now some questions to put you concerning last night. Where did you spend the evening alone? In my own room. You, however, saw your uncle or your cousin during the course of it?" "No, sir, I saw no one after leaving the dinner-table, except Thomas," she added, after a moment's pause. "And how came you to see him?" "He came to bring me the card of a gentleman who called." "May I ask the name of the gentleman?" The name on the card was Mr. Leroy Robbins. The matter seemed trivial, but the sudden start given by the lady at my side made me remember it. "Miss Leavenworth, when seated in your room, are you in the habit of leaving your door open?" A startled look at this, quickly suppressed. "Not in the habit? No? Sir, why did you leave it open last night?" "I was feeling warm." "No other reason?" "I can give no other." "When did you close it?" "Upon retiring." "Was that before or after the servants went up?" "After." "Did you hear me, sir, Howell, when he left the library and ascended to his room?" "I did, sir." "How much longer did you leave your door open after that?" "A few minutes." "I cannot say," she added, hurriedly. "Cannot say. Why? Do you forget?" "I forget just how long after Mr. Howell came up I closed it." "Was it more than 10 minutes?" "Yes, more than 20. "Perhaps." How pale her face was, and how she trembled. "Miss Leavenworth, according to evidence, your uncle came to his death not very long after Mr. Harwell left him. If your door was open, you ought to have heard if any one went to his room, or any pistol shot was fired. Now, did you hear anything?" "I heard no confusion." "No, sir." "Did you hear anything? Nor any pistol shot?" "Leavenworth, excuse my persistence, but did you hear anything?" "I heard a door closed." "What door?" "The library door." "One? I do not know." She clasped her hands hysterically. "I cannot say. Why do you ask me so many questions?" I leaped to my feet. She was swaying, almost fainting. But before I could reach her, she had drawn herself up again, and resumed her former demeanor. "Excuse me," said she. I am not myself this morning. I beg your pardon." And she turned steadily to the coroner. "What was it you asked?" I asked, and his voice grew thin and high. Evidently her manner was beginning to tell against her. "When it was you heard the library door shut." I cannot fix the precise time, but it was after Mr. Harwell came up, and before I closed my own. "And you heard no pistol shot?" "No, sir." The coroner cast a quick look at the jury, who almost to a man glanced aside as he did so. "Miss Leavenworth, we are told that Hannah, one of the servants, started for your room late last night after some medicine. Did she come there?" "No, sir." "When did you first learn of her remarkable disappearance from this house during the night?" "This morning before breakfast. Molly met me in the hall, and asked how Hannah was. I thought the inquiry a strange one, and naturally questioned her. A moment's talk made the conclusion plain that the girl was gone." "What did you think when you became assured of this fact?" "I did not know what to think." "No suspicion of foul play crossed your mind?" "No, Sir Bar." "You did not connect the fact with that of your uncle's murder?" "I did not know of this murder then." "And afterwards?" "Oh?" "Some thought of the possibility of her knowing something about it may have crossed my mind. I cannot say." "Can you tell us anything of this girl's past history?" "I can tell you no more in regard to it than my cousin has done." "Do you not know what made her sad at night?" Her cheek flushed angrily. Was it at his tone or at the question itself?
"No, sir."
"She never confided her secrets to my keeping." "Then you cannot tell us where she would be likely to go upon leaving this house?" "Certainly not." "Miss Leavenworth, we are obliged to put another question to you. We are told it was by your order your uncle's body was removed from where it was found into the next room." She bowed her head. "Didn't you know it to be improper for you or any one else to disturb the body of a person found dead, except in the presence and under the authority of the proper officer?" "I did not consult my knowledge, sir. In regard to the subject, only my feeling dogs." "Then I suppose it was your feelings which prompted you to remain standing by the table at which he was murdered, instead of following the body in and seeing it properly deposited." "Or perhaps," he went on, with relentless sarcasm, "you were too much interested, just then, in the piece of paper you took away, to think much of the proprieties of the occasion." "Paper," lifting her head with determination. "Who says I took a piece of paper from the table? One witness has sworn to seeing you bend over the table upon which several papers lay strewn, another, to meeting you a few minutes later in the hall, just as you were putting a piece of paper into your pocket. The inference follows, Miss Leavenworth." This was a home thrust, and we looked to see some show of agitation, but her haughty lip never quivered. "You have drawn the inference, and you must prove the fact." The answer was stateliness itself, and we were not surprised to see the coroner look a trifle baffled. But, recovering himself, he said, "Miss Leavenworth, I must ask you again whether you did or did not take anything from that table." She folded her arms. "I decline answering the question," she quietly said. "Pardon me," he rejoined. "It is necessary that you should." Her lip took a still more determined curve. "When any suspicious paper is found in my possession, it will be time enough then for me to explain how I came by it." This defiance seemed to quite stagger the coroner. "Do you realize to what this refusal is liable to subject you?" She dropped her head. "I am afraid that I do. Yes, sir." Mr. Gryce lifted his hand and softly twirled the tassel of the window curtain. "And you still persist?" She absolutely disdained to reply. The coroner did not press it further. It had now become evident to all that Eleanor Leavenworth not only stood on her defence, but was perfectly aware of her position, and prepared to maintain it. Even her cousin, who until now had preserved some sort of composure, began to show signs of strong and uncontrollable agitation, as if she found it one thing to utter an accusation herself, and quite another to see it mirrored in the countenances of the men about her. Miss Leavenworth, the coroner continued, changing the line of attack. You have always had free access to your uncle's apartments. Yes, sir. Might even have entered his room late at night, crossed it and stood at his side, without disturbing him sufficiently to cause him to turn his head. Yes, her hands pressing themselves painfully together. Miss Leavenworth, the key to the library door is missing. She made no answer. It has been testified to that previous to the actual discovery of the murder, you visited the door of the library alone. Will you tell us if the key was then in the lock? Not. Are you certain? I am. No. Was there anything peculiar about this key, either in size or shape? She strove to repress the sudden terror which this question produced, glanced carelessly around at the group of servants stationed at her back, and trembled. It was a little different from the others, she finally acknowledged. In what respect? The handle was broken. Ah, gentlemen, the handle was broken, emphasized the coroner, looking towards the jury. Monsieur? Gryce seemed to take this information to himself, for he gave another of his quick nods. You would, then, recognize this key, Miss Leavenworth, if you should see it. She cast a startled look at him, as if she expected to behold it in his hand, but, seeming to gather courage at not finding it produced, replied quite easily, I think I should, sir. The coroner seemed satisfied, and was about to dismiss the witness when Mr. Gryce quietly advanced and touched him on the arm. One moment, said that gentleman, and stooping, he whispered a few words in the coroner's ear, then, recovering himself, stood with his right hand in his breast pocket and his eye upon the chandelier. I scarcely dared to breathe. Had he repeated to the coroner the words he had inadvertently overheard in the hall above? But a glance at the latter's face satisfied me that nothing of such importance had transpired. He looked not only tired, but a trifle annoyed. Miss Leavenworth, said he, turning again in her direction, you have declared that you did not visit your uncle's room last evening. Do you repeat the assertion? I do. He glanced at Miss Gryce, who immediately drew from his breast a handkerchief curiously soiled. It is strange, then, that your handkerchief should have been found this morning in that room. The girl uttered a cry. Then, while Mary's face hardened in a sort of strong despair, Eleanor tightened her lips and coldly replied, I do not see as it is so very strange. I was in that room early this morning, and you dropped it then. A distressed blush crossed her face. She did not reply. Soiled in this way? He went on. I know nothing about the soil. What is it? Let me see. In a moment. What we now wish is to know how it came to be in your uncle's apartment. There are many ways. I might have left it there days ago. I have told you I was in the habit of visiting his room. But first, let me see if it is my handkerchief. And she held out her hand. I presume so, as I am told it has your initials embroidered in the corner, he remarked, as Mr. Gryce passed it to her. But she with horrified voice interrupted him. These dirty spots. What are they? They look like. What they are, said the coroner. If you have ever cleaned a pistol, you must know what they are, Miss Leavenworth. She let the handkerchief fall convulsively from her hand, and stood staring at it, lying before her on the floor. I know nothing about it, gentlemen, she said. It is my handkerchief, but... For some cause she did not finish her sentence, but again repeated, Indeed, gentlemen, I know nothing about it. This closed her testimony. Kate, the cook, was now recalled, and asked to tell when she last washed the handkerchief. This, sir, this handkerchief. Oh, sometime this week, sir, throwing a deprecatory glance at her mistress. What day? Well, I wish I could forget, Miss Eleanor, but I can't. It is the only one like it in the house. I washed it day before yesterday. When did you iron it? Yesterday morning, half choking over the words. And when did you take it to her room? The cook threw her apron over her head. "Yesterday afternoon, with the rest of the clothes just before dinner. Indeed, I could not help it, Miss Eleanor." She whispered, "It was the truth." Eleanor Leavenworth frowned. This somewhat contradictory evidence had very sensibly affected her, and when, a moment later, the coroner, having dismissed the witness, turned towards her, and inquired if she had anything further to say in the way of explanation or otherwise, she threw her hands up almost spasmodically, slowly shook her head, and, without word or warning, fainted quietly away in her chair. A commotion, of course, followed, during which I noticed that Mary did not hasten to her cousin, but left it for Molly and Kate to do what they could toward her resuscitation. In a few moments this was in so far accomplished that they were enabled to lead her from the room. As they did so, I observed a tall man rise and follow her out. A momentary silence ensued, soon broken, however, by an impatient stir as our little juryman rose and proposed that the jury should now adjourn for the day. This seeming to fall in with the coroner's views, he announced that the inquest would stand adjourned till 3 o'clock the next day, when he trusted all the jurors would be present. A general rush followed, that in a few minutes emptied the room of all but Miss Leavenworth, Mr. Gryce, and myself.